Hey there, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, please hit that sub button and join the family. Smash that like button if you enjoyed today's stories. It was one of those Thursdays where you don't expect anything major to happen. I'd just gotten out of work, my phone buzzed, and it was Minnie confirming our dinner plans. We got introduced to this weird daisy chain of friends and friends of friends. Someone I met at a party who knew someone she went to school with or something like that. I'd seen a couple of pictures of her floating around online, and she looked cute, kind of glamorous, but with that super polished social media vibe. I figured we'd go grab some food, see how things go, and maybe just have a nice evening. She picked a restaurant, a small Chinese place tucked between a dry cleaner and a vape shop downtown. I got there a little early and grabbed a seat by the window. The kind of place with old laminate tables, a weird fish tank near the register, and laminated menus with faded photos of dishes no one orders. It smelled like soy sauce and fried garlic, which I didn't mind at all. She showed up maybe 10 minutes later, wearing heels that sounded way too loud for the cracked tile floor and a bright red coat that looked expensive, and probably was. I stood up, said hey, and she gave me that sideways look like she was already halfway bored. No hug, not even a handshake. She sat down across from me and didn't even pretend to look at the menu. I figured maybe she'd been here before and knew what she wanted. No. As soon as we ordered, I had some beef noodles. She asked for steamed veggies and tea. She launched straight into it. I hadn't even asked her a real question yet, just something casual like how her day had been. And suddenly we were in this deep, full-on monologue. She started talking about how she was tired of seeing women trying to act like men in the workplace, and how she fully believed that once a woman got married, her job should be staying at home. I blinked a couple times, trying to catch up, thinking maybe I misheard her or she was being sarcastic. But she was dead serious. She leaned in like she was dropping wisdom, saying things like it's dangerous for women to handle their own finances and that it's a husband's responsibility to take full control. I nodded once just to keep the energy from getting weird, but I already knew this was not going to go anywhere. She wasn't even making it a conversation. It was like I was a podcast listener who didn't get to press pause. She started listing off what she expected in a marriage: 2 kids, a house with double garage, monthly spa budget, and get this, a wedding ring that costs over $100,000. She actually said that. 100,000, like it was the bare minimum. I thought about making a joke or steering the topic somewhere else, but she wasn't picking up anything I was putting down. She didn't ask me a single question. Not one. Just kept talking about how men these days are soft and confused, and how she needed someone strong enough to take the wheel in her life because she deserved to be spoiled. The waiter brought our food, and I used that as an excuse to break her monologue, but she just kept going between bites like even eating didn't slow her down. The weirdest part was how confident she was the entire time, like there wasn't a shadow of doubt in her voice. She even started talking about ring cuts and diamond clarity like we were shopping already. I barely finished my food. She took 2 bites of hers and started scrolling through her phone while talking about how most men are intimidated by powerful women. Then she looked up, almost like she just remembered I was there, and said, "You look like you'd understand that." At that point, I just gave her a little smile, nodded again, and said something like, "Interesting take," which was code for I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole. We wrapped up the meal I paid, obviously, and she barely said thanks. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, told me I seemed nice, but she was still evaluating options, and waved me off like we were at a business seminar. I walked back to my car in silence, just playing the whole date back in my head like, did that really happen? Did I really just sit through a monologue about surrendering personal freedom and buying diamonds like I'm Jeff Bezos? Anyway, I didn't text her after that. Not even a thanks for dinner. I figured we both knew there was no second date coming. But the wild part: a few days later, someone sent me a screenshot of her latest Instagram post. She'd posted a selfie with some inspirational caption, something about men being broke and intimidated by real women. She called herself a modern feminist queen and said she was done wasting time with peasants. I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't even bitter, just disbelief. The woman who told me on a first date that she wanted her husband to control everything, needed a ring the price of a car, and went on to call herself a feminist icon for dumping a guy who didn't argue with her. I guess in her mind, I failed some kind of hidden test. Either way, I slept just fine that night. I wasn't even gonna go on this date, honestly. It was one of those days where nothing really felt right. I'd woken up late, spilled iced coffee on my shirt, and I was already annoyed about everything by the time it hit noon. But for some reason, I didn't cancel. Maybe it was because I've been putting myself out there more and I felt guilty for costing the last guy. Or maybe because Simon didn't seem awful, at least not from his dating app messages. He was polite, asked decent questions, and had a picture of himself holding a dog. You know the type. We picked a small local cafe near the university. Not the trendy kind with wall plants and la tie art, but the kind with chipped mugs, mismatched furniture, and people studying with headphones on for hours without buying anything. I liked that vibe. It felt like you could just sit and talk without some playlist blaring in the background or a waiter hovering every 2 minutes. I showed up wearing jeans and a simple sweater, nothing too dressy. I remember second guessing my outfit while walking in, wondering if I should have put on earrings or done something different with my hair. Stupid stuff, but I guess that's what dating makes you do, spiral over nothing. He was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, legs crossed, flipping through what looked like a planner or maybe a journal. He had a light blue button up and round glasses. Not bad looking, I'll give him that. Kind of preppy in a guy who was a camp counselor sort of way. He stood up to greet me, said hey, and then sat back down before I could even fully pull my chair out. I tried to ignore it. First date jitters, right? We both ordered coffee. He got an espresso. I went for a cold brew. Nothing fancy. For the first few minutes, things were fine. Light chatter, small stuff. He asked about my job, told me he worked in data analytics, mentioned he liked reading but only nonfiction. That last part should have been a red flag, but I let it slide. Everyone has preferences. Then, maybe 10 minutes in, right when I started thinking the date was going okay, he reached into his backpack, pulled out the same notebook he'd been flipping through earlier, and said he had something a bit different he liked to do on first dates. Before I could say anything, he opened it to a fresh page, uncapped a pen, and told me he was gonna rate me. I actually thought it was a joke at first. I even kind of laughed, like, okay, what's the punchline? But he was already scribbling in the notebook. He said it helped him stay objective when dating, and that he didn't want emotions clouding his judgment. I sat there, still holding my straw like a moron, not sure whether to grab my drink and leave or just see how far this would go. He started listing off my features like he was an art critic describing a statue. He gave my hair a 7 out of 10, said it was a little flat but nice color. My eyes got an 8, which apparently was solid, though he said they lacked mystery. My smile was a 6.5 because I had slightly crooked teeth. My body got a 7.8, which made me want to ask where the 8 came from, but I stayed quiet. Then he added something like, don't worry, no one ever gets a 10. I'm very strict with scoring. I wanted to walk out right there, but part of me was just frozen. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. He flipped the page and started comparing me to his exes. Not just bae comparisons either. He read out their names, what scores they got, and what parts of me were better or worse. I remember him saying, you actually have better posture than Mia, and you seem more organized than Lily. He said all this like he was talking about spreadsheet columns. It was so detached, like I wasn't even a person sitting in front of him. Like he was building a dating profile in his head and I was just data. I finally asked him why he thought this was okay to do, and he looked surprised, like genuinely caught off guard, and said, wouldn't you rather know where you stand than waste time? Then added that women were always saying they wanted honesty, but they couldn't handle it. I think that was the moment I decided not to argue. Not because he made a point. God, no, but because I knew he'd twist anything I said into some weird debate. The guy clearly didn't want a relationship, he wanted control. Like the whole date was an interview and I was being measured for compatibility based on numbers that only made sense to him. After that, he went back to sipping his espresso like nothing had happened. Asked me if I wanted to split a pastry, which I obviously declined. I sat through maybe 10 more minutes just out of pure curiosity, like what other insane thing is he going to say? He told me he had a system for choosing second dates too, where he ranked chemistry, conversation flow, and whether the person matched their online photos. I read the score column over his shoulder. It was already half filled. Eventually, when I said I had to go, pretending I had somewhere to be, he barely looked up. Just said, cool, let me know if you want to hang out again. I'll review my notes tonight. I walked home that day trying to process what just happened. It was like being inside some sort of bizarre social experiment, like someone tried to combine dating with a math test. I kept thinking, this is a guy who probably watches tutorial videos on how to flirt and tracks emotional responses on a graph. Later that night, I checked the app and saw he unmatched me, which honestly made me laugh out loud. Like I'd failed the audition or didn't meet the metric. It's weird how much people reveal when they're trying to hide behind logic or structure. The guy with a notepad and a calculator where his heart should be. Never again. It started on one of those weird in between evenings, like not quite a weekday vibe, but not full weekend energy either. You know what I mean? I've been at this networking event that was supposed to be about startups and young entrepreneurs, but it really just felt like a bunch of people standing around with free drinks, pretending they had business cards. I'd gone with my roommate, who dipped halfway through, so I was stuck chatting with strangers about things I didn't actually care about. I was hovering near the mini meatballs tray when I first talked to Ikra. She had this bright orange scarf on and a confident way of talking, like she was narrating her own show or something. I remember she was mid-sentence about sustainable fashion when she turned to me and said, "You seem normal," which honestly is probably the best compliment I've gotten at one of those things. We started talking about music and food and how awkward those events were. I wasn't thinking date at first, just glad to be talking to someone who didn't open with, "What do you do?" But by the end of the night, we'd swapped numbers and decided to go for sushi that weekend. It seemed low pressure. Sushi places are usually chill, and I'd wanted to try this new spot near the edge of town anyway. Small, kind of quiet, not overly fancy. Looked like the kind of place you could actually hear the person across from you. When Saturday rolled around, I got there a little early. Wore a black shirt and sneakers, nothing extra. I was kind of excited, not gonna lie. She seemed smart, interesting, and she was definitely attractive. I figured this could actually be a good time. And she walked in. But she wasn't alone. Behind her was a teenage boy, maybe 14 or 15, dressed in cargo shorts and a hoodie, holding a Nintendo Switch. No warning, no heads up. Just, here's this random kid I've never seen before, and now he's part of our dinner. I stood up, half expecting her to introduce him as her little cousin she had to drop off somewhere. But she just smiled and said, "Hope you don't mind, this is my brother. He's tagging along." I didn't know what to say. Like, what do you even say to that? Cool, I love being third wheel on a dinner I thought was a date. So I just nodded like an idiot and said hi to the kid, who barely looked up from his game. We sat down, and it was immediately awkward. The table was small, meant for two, so we were all crammed together, trying not to elbow each other. I figured she'd explain at some point, but she just launched into the menu like this was normal. Asked if I liked spicy tuna, started recommending things, and told the waiter we'd probably order a lot. "He's hungry," she said, pointing to her brother. "He eats like a grown man." Her brother didn't say much. He just sat there clicking buttons and occasionally nodding. But halfway through her second glass of green tea, Ikra leaned over and told him, "You need to watch how he handles this. This is how you learn to vet people." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She said she brings him on dates sometimes so he can see how men behave and learn to spot red flags early. Then she said I should feel honored because he didn't come along with just anyone. It was the weirdest combination of flattery and manipulation I've ever seen. Like, thanks for the honor of being watched like a zoo exhibit. At this point, I was too deep in it to walk out, so I went along with it. We ordered way too much food: sushi rolls, sashimi, miso soup, even some weird fried thing that her brother wanted. I was still trying to pivot the vibe into something more normal, so I kept asking questions, making small talk, trying not to come off like I was panicking internally. Every time I'd say something, she'd turn to her brother like, "You hear that? That's how they try to impress you." And the kid would just grunt or smirk. I couldn't tell if he was having fun or just embarrassed to be there. Maybe both. I asked once if it was awkward for him to be at dinner with two adults he didn't know, and Ikra just shrugged and said, "He's mature. He needs to know what's out there," like we were training him for combat. When the bill came, it was close to $90. I pulled out my card out of habit, but also because I assumed we were splitting two people. She didn't even look at it, just handed the receipt over to me and went back to drinking her tea. Her brother had already gone back to his game. Then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "This is part of the test. Real men don't hesitate." I wasn't even sure what I was being tested for at this point. Patience, wallet strength, tolerance for being made into a lid demonstration. I paid, mostly just to be done with the whole thing. I didn't want to stand there arguing about $15 of tempura, and I definitely didn't want to lecture a stranger about dating etiquette in front of her teenage brother. After we left the restaurant, she hugged me like it had been a great time and said we should do it again sometime. Her brother just nodded and walked ahead like a bodyguard or something. I said, yeah, sure, and went the opposite direction. She texted the next morning saying her brother thought I had potential. I didn't reply. Didn't block her either. I don't know why, but I definitely wasn't going back for round two. A few weeks later, I saw her at another event and she was with some other guy. No brother in sight this time. Maybe I failed the test, or maybe the brother job was done. Okay, so I don't usually start conversations in bookstores, like ever. I go in, I browse, I overthink if I really need another novel, and then I leave. But this time, I was standing in the history aisle trying to decide between two random books on empires I'd never fully care about, when this guy next to me says something about how the Mongols were misunderstood. I laughed a little and said I was just judging books by their covers because both looked boring. He said that was honest. I don't know why, but we kept talking for like 15 minutes, not even about books. We talked about movies that were based on books and then totally spun off into burgers somehow. He said there was this place nearby with amazing truffle fries, and right there, he was like, wanna go. It was so impulsive and unexpected that I said yes without really thinking. Maybe that's on me. Maybe I was bored. Or maybe because he had this super casual confidence like he'd done this before, just met someone and convinced them to eat with him 20 minutes later. I didn't even feel weird about it until we were already walking to the restaurant and I realized I didn't know his last name. His name was Zidane. He was into history, wore a black denim jacket, and had this kind of half smirk when he talked, like he always thought he was being clever. We got to the burger spot, which was small and half empty except for some guy in the back watching sports really loud. The place smelled amazing though, greasy and warm and exactly the kind of spot that doesn't care if you wipe your hands on too many napkins. We sat near the window. He ordered a double patty burger with mushrooms, and I went with something simple because I wasn't that hungry but didn't want to seem like I wasn't trying. Small talk continued. Music, favorite cartoons growing up, travel stories, stuff like that. It wasn't deep, but it was flowing. And then it shifted. We were halfway through eating when he put his burger down and asked if I'd ever been pregnant. Just like that. Like he was asking if I'd ever been to France. No lead in, no warning. I was mid chew. I thought maybe I misheard, so I just raised an eyebrow, trying to play it cool. But he doubled down, said it was an important thing to know early. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said he believed people should be fully transparent from the start, especially women, and that pregnancy history was part of that. He didn't say it in a judgmental way exactly, more like he was presenting a new hiring policy. He called it full disclosure culture. I kid you not. I tried to deflect by saying something like, that's kind of personal for a first date, hoping he'd back off. But nope. He just went into this whole explanation about how relationships only work when both people know each other's full background. And by background, he meant dating history, literal lists. Who you dated, how long, how physical it got, who ended it, why it ended. He said he'd been working on his own list to give future partners. I asked if this was something he'd actually done before, and he said yeah, and that one girl had told him she dated too many guys to count, and that he walked out of the cafe right then because it wasn't aligned with his values. The thing was, he didn't sound angry. It was worse, he sounded proud of himself, like he dodged a bullet and stuck to his standards. He asked how many people I'd dated, not even in a curious or flirty way, just dry and blunt like he was checking a box. I said I wasn't comfortable talking about that over burgers with someone I just met, and he nodded like he respected that, but then said, well, I'd want to know before a second date. It was weirdly robotic, like he watched too many self-help videos online and now thought relationships were interviews with timelines and red flags and checklists. He even told me his ideal was someone who'd only been in 2 relationships before him. Anything more than 3, he said, is usually a sign of instability. I tried to laugh off again and said, wow, dating must be hard for you. But he didn't even crack a smile, just looked down at his fries and said something like, I have a clear vision. That helps. At that point, I started thinking about the exit strategy. I still had half a drink left, but I started sipping faster. He seemed totally unaware of the vibe shift, still talking about honesty and how modern dating is chaotic because no one has standards anymore. I don't even remember what I said after that. I kind of let him ramble while I nodded and glanced at the clock on my phone like every 2 minutes. When the bill came, he actually paused before reaching for it and said, "Normally I wouldn't pay on a first date unless there's long-term potential, but I'll make an exception." Then winked. It didn't even feel insulting. It felt like I was watching someone who convinced themselves they were being noble, when really they were just socially out of touch. We walked outside, and he said something about hoping we could continue the conversation again soon. I just smiled, said maybe, and went in the opposite direction like my life depended on it. I didn't block him right away. I waited until the next morning when he sent this long text saying he enjoyed meeting me and would appreciate receiving a detailed list of past partners before moving forward. He actually wrote that, like it was the most reasonable request in the world. I read it twice just to make sure it wasn't a joke. It wasn't. Zidane asked if I'd ever been pregnant before even finishing his burger, and wanted a complete romantic resume before the second date. Honestly, at this point, I'm just collecting these stories like weird souvenirs. I wasn't even supposed to be at that dog park. I was filling in for my sister who had to work late, and she begged me to take her golden retriever, Max, out so he wouldn't explode from energy. I don't even own a dog, okay. I'm not one of those people. I like dogs, sure, but I never saw myself doing the whole walk, pick up, poop, make dog friends routine. But Max needed his zoomies, so I grabbed the leash and headed over around 5 in the evening. The park was full of the usual suspects: hipsters with French bulldogs, two moms with matching poodles, a guy throwing a frisbee like his life depended on it. Max instantly ran toward this group of dogs near the water fountain, and while I was untangling his leash from a bench, Amira came up behind me. She had this super chill look, oversized hoodie, joggers, messy bun. Honestly, I thought she worked at a yoga studio or something. Her dog, some small fuzzy thing that looked like it barked for attention more than safety, was bouncing around Max like it had main character energy. We both kind of laughed, and then we started talking. She was funny, witty in that fast-talking, eye-rolling kind of way. We talked for maybe 20 minutes while our dogs acted like they were training for a circus. At one point, she asked if I wanted to grab lunch sometime. I was surprised because she made the first move, but I said yeah. I figured why not. It had been a while since I'd gone out with anyone I didn't meet through an app. We made plans for Saturday. She picked the spot, a vegan cafe that I hadn't tried yet. One of those earthy places with smoothies that cost like $14 and menus with no capital letters. I showed up right on time, wore a decent t-shirt, and had Max with me again because she said it was dog friendly and her dog would be coming too. I thought that was kind of cute, like we were doing a soft double date. She showed up 10 minutes late but walked in like she owned the place. I waved, and she gave me this tight little smile and sat down across from me. Her dog was in one of those portable stroller things. No joke, the baby stroller. I didn't even know people really used those outside of Instagram. We ordered. She got a quinoa bowl and a spirulina smoothie. I had a mushroom wrap and a ginger soda. All good. I was ready for a chill, casual date with dog chatter and maybe some harmless flirting. When I got was a lecture. About 20 minutes in, I made a comment about how I don't really see myself having kids. It wasn't even out of nowhere. She asked what my life plan looked like, and I said I wanted to travel more, focus on work, maybe adopt a dog if I ever live in a place with a yard, and that I wasn't really planning on becoming a parent. Her face changed instantly. She blinked like I'd said I kicked puppies for fun. Then she said, "Wait, you never. You're not just saying that for now." I told her, yeah, I'd thought about it a lot, and I was pretty sure. Kids weren't something I felt drawn to. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms, and the lecture began. She started off with this whole thing about how women like me were falling for capitalist propaganda, and that choosing not to have kids was selfish. Her words, not mine. I tried to respond lightly, saying something like, "I think it's just a personal choice." But she wasn't having it. She said there's nothing personal about refusing to contribute to the future of the human race. I thought she was exaggerating, maybe being dramatic for the sake of conversation. But then she started quoting birth rates in Western countries, talking about fertility decline like she was reading from a science article, and telling me that if women don't step up, we're gonna see the end of civilization. It was so intense, I kind of just froze. Like I wasn't sure whether to argue, laugh, or just sit there nodding like I was in a weird documentary. She said things like, "You owe it to the earth to continue the cycle, and your ancestors didn't fight through history so you could be childless by choice." I wanted to tell her my ancestors probably also didn't walk around with spirulina smoothies, but I held that one in. Every time I tried to bring out the idea that parenthood isn't for everyone, or that some people just don't want it, she cut me off. Said I'd change my mind when I matured, and that women who said they didn't want kids were usually just scared of responsibility. At some point, her dog started whining, and she ignored it completely, just kept going, talking about wounds like they were factories we were letting sit unused. I couldn't even focus on my rap anymore. Then she hit me with this gem. You're not just cheating your future children, you're cheating yourself out of the most sacred role a woman can have. I looked around to see if anyone else was listening. One guy 2 tables over gave me a look like, "You good?" I didn't answer. I was too busy trying to figure out how the date had turned into a fertility TED talk. The worst part, she wasn't even mad. She was calm, convicted, like she'd been waiting her whole life to tell someone off for not wanting to raise a family. When the check came, I offered to split it, and she said sure, but with this tone like, "Of course you'd split it, you're that type." We walked out together, our dogs barely noticing each other this time. I was quiet. I didn't know how to end it without making it weirder. She gave me a small hug and said something like, "I hope you think seriously about what we talked about. You're not too far gone." Too far gone. Like I joined a cult of anti-baby rebels or something. I went home, fed Max, and sat on the couch trying to decompress. She texted me the next morning thanking me for the productive conversation. I didn't respond. That was Amira. Took me out, made me feel like I was a threat to humanity for not wanting kids, and probably thinks I need spiritual reprogramming. First and last date. I met Joseph at this local art show my coworker invited me to. She had an extra ticket, and I didn't have plans that night, so I just said sure without even asking what it was. I figured it would be some weird abstract stuff and overpriced wine, and I wasn't totally wrong. There were a lot of paintings of squiggles and mannequins with wings for no reason. I remember walking around pretending I got it when I really didn't. It was one of those things where you just say interesting and nod slowly. Joseph was standing near this piece with broken mirrors glued to a canvas. He was tall, wearing a black turtleneck like he was part of the show, or maybe wanted people to think he was. He made a comment about how the piece felt like it was forcing self-reflection, which sounds pretentious, but the way he said it made me laugh. We ended up talking for a while, not even about art, really. We mostly joked about how confused we both were, how everyone else looked like they were pretending to be deep. He seemed easygoing and sharp, kind of charming in a calm, observant way. He didn't try too hard, which was a nice break from the usual overly excited guys I'd met through dating apps. Before I left, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, and I gave him my number. We met up 3 days later at this small indie cafe tucked behind a bookstore downtown. You know the type. 2 baristas with nose rings, hand-painted mugs, a special board with quotes from dead philosophers. I liked the vibe. It felt chill but not boring. I got there first and grabbed a table near the window, scrolling through my phone trying to look casual. He walked in 5 minutes later, gave a quick wave, and sat down across from me. So far, so good. We ordered, he had a flat white, I got a cappuccino, and we started talking about random things. It was light at first. Books, travel stories, bad date horror stories. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up from his coffee, smiled, and said, "You actually look better than I expected based on your pictures." I paused. I wasn't even sure I heard him right. I laughed awkwardly and asked what he meant. He just repeated it like it was a compliment. Like, "No shade, your pics are fine, but you're much more attractive in person." I didn't know what to say. Like, thanks? Or, sorry for the inaccurate photo album. I just nodded and tried to move on, but the vibe had already started to shift. He picked up on it and said, "I'm just being honest, most people edit their photos too much these days." It was that kind of tone where it sounds like he's trying to praise you while still letting you know he's doing you a favor by saying it. I wasn't flattered, I was confused, but I let it slide. Then he asked if I was currently seeing anyone else. I told him no and asked if he was. He smiled again and said, "Well, kind of, but I'd like to be upfront about things." I didn't even have time to process that before he went on to explain that he was experimenting with non-monogamy. Not in a let's be open-minded together way, but in a I'm dating 3 people right now and just seeing who sticks way. He said he liked having options and didn't want to commit too early because relationships are like startups. You invest in a few and see which one takes off. That line made my brain short circuit for a second. I was sitting there with a half-drunk cappuccino, wondering how I ended up being compared to a business venture. He told me he had what he called a rotation. That's the word he used. Rotation. Like a basketball team or a playlist. He said some girls were cool with it and others weren't, but he appreciated when people didn't get overly emotional about exclusivity. I asked what he was expecting from this date. Like, was I supposed to apply for a spot in the rotation? And he said, no pressure. We're just seeing if you'd be a good fit while I figure things out. I don't even know how I kept a straight face. I should have left right then. But something about how casually he said all this made me curious. I had to see how much further it would go. I asked if the other women knew about each other, and he said kind of, which is a pretty solid no, if you ask me. He said he tries to maintain healthy boundaries and gives each woman a different day of the week. That asked if I'd be open to being a weekday partner since weekends were usually booked. A weekday partner. Like I was a gym class or a dentist appointment. I said I wasn't really into sharing people, and he said that's totally fair, but also added that monogamy is a social construct and kind of outdated. Then went on this short rant about how we've been conditioned to expect too much from one person, and that spreading emotional labor was actually more sustainable. I wish I could tell you he said all this with some deep conviction or passion, but it was the opposite. He said it like someone who just watched a YouTube video about it and now wanted to repeat it back at someone before forgetting. Eventually, he checked his phone and said he had to head out soon. I was fine with that. I was more than fine with that. He offered to walk me in my car, which I politely declined. As we stood up, he asked if I wanted to grab dinner later in the week. Nothing too serious, just keep hanging out, see what happens. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't. When I got home, I read through our earlier texts and tried to figure out if there were signs I missed. There weren't. He'd been charming and normal until the date started turning into a TED Talk on dating like a tech bro. He messaged me a few days later with a photo of his coffee and the caption, thinking of you. Thursday might open up. I left it on read. It was one of those parties where you barely know anyone, and you spend most of the night awkwardly holding a drink you don't even like just to have something to do with your hands. My friend from college had invited me, said it'd be chill, and I didn't have anything better to do that weekend. I figured I'd go, stay for an hour, pretend I had early plans, and bounce. But I ended up staying longer than I meant to because I started talking to Freya. She was sitting on the porch steps smoking a cigarette like she was in a music video. Not a real heavy smoker kind of thing. More like the aesthetic kind where you could tell it was about the vibe more than the nicotine. She had a leather jacket, 2 nose rings, and a way of talking like she'd read your mind before you even opened your mouth. I complimented her boots. She said they were stolen from her ex during an argument. We both laughed and kept talking for over an hour, which felt fast. Easy too. We exchanged numbers before I left, and she texted me later that night saying, let's go for drinks soon. I want to see if you're as funny sober. I like that energy. She was playful, sarcastic, and just intense enough to keep you guessing. We met the following Friday at this low-key bar she picked. It had dark lighting, an old jukebox, and booths with cracked leather seats. There was a live band setting up in the corner and people playing pool in the back. It felt like one of those places that didn't care who you were or why you were there, which I always kind of liked. Freya showed up wearing a giant plaid coat and eyeliner that looked like it took effort not to look like it took effort. She hugged me right away and ordered us both drinks without asking what I wanted, which I weirdly didn't mind. It was kind of bold in a way that worked for her. She handed me a gin and tonic and said, you seem like someone who drinks this, and smiled like she knew she was probably wrong. We talked for a long time. Not the usual first date cue backslash and but more like weird tangents. Bad tattoos, weird dreams, childhood fears. At one point, she told me she thought marriage was outdated but would still wear a wedding dress just for the aesthetic. She made jokes about astrology, told me she was a Pisces but not the annoying kind, and said she trusted dogs more than most people. I was into it. She was strange but in a magnetic way. And then, mid-conversation about favorite movies, she casually dropped a sentence that made me pause. She said, my ex still lives with me, but it's totally not a thing. I kind of stared at her for a second, waiting for a follow-up or a laugh or some kind of joke. but she just sipped her drink like she'd said she had a roommate named Jen. I asked her to explain, and she said she and her ex had dated for like 3 years, broken up 6 months ago, and decided it made more sense financially to stay in the same apartment. Rent was too high to live alone, and they already knew each other's routines, so why not, is how she put it. I asked the next obvious question. Was it awkward? She said not really, that they were cool now that the romance was dead and buried, and they were basically just homies. That felt strange, but I was trying not to jump to conclusions. I've heard of exes being friends, and sure, it's rare but not impossible. But then she kept talking. She mentioned they still shared a Netflix account, split groceries, and sometimes cooked dinner together when schedules matched up. I was like, okay, that's a lot of entanglement for people who are just roommates. And then, because of course, she said, we'd also sleep together sometimes, but only for comfort. I don't even remember how I responded to that. My brain was just trying to keep up. It wasn't like she was ashamed of it. She was very matter of fact, like she was telling me what brand of cereal she liked. Only for comfort, she repeated, as if that made it better. I asked if she thought that might be confusing for her or for him. She said not really, and that she was emotionally available for new connections, and that doing it wasn't love and didn't have to mean anything. She said it with this philosophical tone like she'd said it to herself 1,000 times already. I didn't know what to do with that. I wasn't even judging her, I just genuinely didn't know how I was supposed to feel sitting across from someone who was openly telling me their ex was still part of their nightly routine like a weighted blanket. She must have noticed the look on my face because she laughed and said, I'm being honest. That's a good thing, right? And yeah, I guess it was good in a weird way. She didn't lie, she didn't hide it. She didn't wait until the third date to let it slip. But it also didn't feel like something I could be chill about. I like honesty. I'm just not sure I want a package with an active X in the background like a subscription that hasn't expired yet. We finished our drinks, and she walked into my car. She didn't try to kiss me. Just gave me this look that said, you're either into the chaos or you're not. Then she said, text me if you want to hang out again. No pressure. I didn't text her. She posted something on her story the next day. Her and a guy clinking wine glasses in their kitchen. Same plaid coat, same eyeliner. Caption said, unbothered and well fed. I didn't have to guess who the guy was. So she was wild, funny, honest to a fault, and still sharing a bed with someone she says she's over. I don't even know if I could be mad about it. It was like watching a movie where the plot twist hits in the middle and you realize the whole thing was never going to end clean. So I was trying to get into hiking. Not like intense mountaintop at sunrise hiking, but more like walk through some trees and feel healthy type stuff. I just moved to a new part of town and didn't know that many people yet, so I downloaded this hiking app that had trails and group meetups, and apparently a dating feature. I wasn't even looking for that part, but one day this guy Jack messaged me through the app. Said he liked my trail review, which was just me complaining about bugs and calling a hill disrespectful, and asked if I wanted to go on a hike together sometime. I checked out his profile. He looked normal. Outdoorsy, lots of flannel and nature pics, the usual. His bio said something like, here for fresh air, good convos, and meaningful connections. A little cheesy but harmless. He seemed chill, and I liked the idea of a date that wasn't just sitting across a table pretending you know how to talk about wine. We agreed to meet on a Saturday morning at this nature reserve about 30 minutes from where I live. I showed up in leggings, a hoodie, a pair of sneakers that were probably more fashion than function. Whatever. I had snacks, water, and zero expectations. Jack pulled up in a Jeep, which felt aggressively on brand. He was tall, had that I used to play high school sports but don't talk about it energy, and smiled like he knew people always told him he had a nice smile. The first few minutes of the hike were fine. It was one of those wide trails with a slight incline and a lot of shade. I thought it'd be awkward trying to hold a conversation while walking, but it actually made it easier. We talked about the usual stuff, music, favorite foods, dumb things we tripped over. He was funny in a dry way, made a couple sarcastic comments about birdwatchers we passed, and I started to think, okay, maybe this is gonna be a good day. Then somewhere around mile 2, things got weird. He started bringing up stuff I hadn't told him. Not in the app, not in conversation, not anywhere that made sense. At first, I thought I was mishearing him. He asked if I still had my old cat. I never mentioned owning a cat. Then he asked how I was feeling about that car accident from last summer. I froze a little. That accident was months ago, and the only place I'd ever talk about it was in a caption on a post I deleted. That's when it hit me. He had been following me on social media, like deeply, not just a scroll through last week's pics follow. This was research. He read my posts, remembered them, and was now bringing them up like they were things I told him in person. I asked him how he knew about the accident, and he said, "Oh, I used to follow you before we matched. Your profile came up in my suggested list like forever ago." Forever ago. He said it like it was funny, like it was cute that he'd been watching my life from a distance before finally getting a chance to talk to me. I asked how long he'd been following me, and he said, probably since spring, maybe March. This was July. That's 4 months of me posting dog pics, memes, and the occasional rant about oat milk, all being consumed by a guy I didn't know existed until a week ago. Then he casually dropped that he'd seen my short haircut back when he first posted it, not when you re-uploaded the new one last month. I blinked. I deleted that first post because I didn't like how I looked in it. He remembered it. He read it. He probably scrolled back for it. I didn't even know how to respond. Part of me wanted to call it stalker behavior, but another part of me wondered if this was just how people were now. Is it weird if someone knows stuff about you that you put online, even if you deleted it later? I felt exposed in this weird, non-dangerous, but still uncomfortable way. Like someone had been eavesdropping on a conversation I forgot I was having in public. He must have noticed I got quiet because he asked if he said something wrong. I told him I just didn't expect him to know so much about me already. He said, "I just feel like I know someone before I reach out. That's all." And I guess that would have sounded sweet if it wasn't for the fact that he basically studied me like a final exam. He even remembered the name of the beach I posted about during a weekend trip in April. I didn't want to cause a scene, and we still had to loop back to the parking lot. So I nodded and tried to keep the mood light, but the conversation was different after that. I stopped volunteering information. He kept trying, bringing up mutual interests he only knew we had because of old captions. Like how I used to make playlists for long drives, or how I once posted about wanting to learn sign language. The walk back felt longer than the hike out. At one point, I tripped over a root because I wasn't paying attention, and he joked that I even tripped like that one time you posted a meme about clumsiness. I don't even know what that meant. It felt like being watched on a delay. We finally got back to the cars. He offered to grab smoothies nearby, but I told him I had errands to run. He said cool, gave me a hug that lasted just a second too long, and said, "Let me know if you want to hike again. I've got some other trails I think you'd love." I got in my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a bit trying to figure out how creeped out I should be. It wasn't a horror story. It wasn't threatening. But it wasn't okay either. It was like he skipped the entire getting to know you part and replaced it with memory recall for my internet presence. Later that night, I checked my socials and saw his account had liked a post from 2 years ago. I blocked him. I'll be real. I wasn't even planning to go out that night. It was trivia night at a bar I'd never been to, and I'd already talked myself out of it twice. But my coworker guilt-tripped me because their team was short one person, and apparently I was the only one who knew anything about movie quotes and old TV shows. So I went. I wore a hoodie, didn't even do my hair properly, and told myself I'd leave after one drink whether we won or not. Amanda was already sitting with the group when I got there. She had this sharp, put-together look, winged eyeliner, dark lipstick, and a leather jacket that looked like it had been through some stuff. She didn't smile much, but she made good eye contact, and every time she answered a trivia question, she looked around the table like she expected applause. I think what caught my attention was how sure of herself she was. Like, she'd buzz in before the question even ended and still be right. We got paired up for the final round. She slid her chair next to mine and said, "Hope you're better than you look," which somehow didn't sound as rude as it should have. I raised an eyebrow, said, "You'll see," and we ended up getting second place. Afterward, the team went to grad food, but Amanda asked if I wanted to go somewhere quieter and actually talk. I said yeah. I figured anyone that confident had to be interesting one-on-one. We ended up at this small diner about a 10-minute walk from the bar. It was one of those places that never updates their menu and has the same 5 booths since the 90s. The kind of place where the staff call everyone Han and refill your coffee before you ask. It was late enough that we basically had the place to ourselves, which made it easier to actually talk without all the background noise. At first, it was great. She was intense, yeah, but in a way that kept me on my toes. She talked about her undergrad days, how she got into political science, how she nearly joined a campaign team, but decided she hated bureaucracy too much. She had opinions on everything: books, education, government, parenting, even fast food branding. I didn't agree with her on all of it, but she didn't care. She liked arguing, which was fine with me because I'm used to people disagreeing with me. But then we started talking about reading, and everything started to flip. I mentioned I'd been trying to read more lately, and she immediately asked what was on my shelf. I told her some fiction, a couple philosophy books, a mix of stuff I'd picked up over the years. She asked if I'd read a specific political memoir that I'd honestly never even heard of. I said no. Then she named another. I said no again. That's when she got this weird look on her face, like I'd said I was a flat earther or something. She asked, "Are you open to changing your reading list?" And I kind of laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. She pulled out her phone, opened a notes app, and started reading off titles like a checklist. She said they were required reading for anyone she dated seriously, and that she'd broken up with people before because they didn't align with her intellectually. I was sitting there eating fries, trying to keep up, while she told me which books were acceptable, which authors were problematic, and how she'd purge her own shelf of anything that fed the wrong narratives. She said reading wasn't just a hobby, it was a statement, and that being neutral or apolitical was basically siding with oppression. I didn't even know what to say. It wasn't that I disagreed with everything. Some of the books she mentioned were ones I'd actually been meaning to get to, but it was the way she said it. Like if you hadn't read them already, you were already behind. She wasn't recommending, she was demanding. Then she said it. "If we're gonna keep talking, I need you to go through your books and get rid of anything that glorifies outdated systems." I thought she was joking again, but she looked at me dead serious and said, "I'm not going to date someone who defends harmful ideas by keeping them on a shelf. What you own says everything." I tried to play it cool. I said something like, "I think it's okay to read things you don't agree with. It doesn't mean you support them," and she cut me off. Said that's what people say when they want to keep pretending they're informed without doing the work. She asked what political podcasts I listen to, what kind of news sources I trust, and if I've ever donated to grassroots orgs. When I said I mostly read articles from different sides to form my own view, she told me that was lazy centrist nonsense. The whole date turned into an interview, not even just politics. At one point, she asked if I'd ever dated someone who disagreed with me on major issues, and when I said yeah, she shook her head like I just told her I lived there for fun. I was still trying to finish my burger while she explained why certain words should be retired from public vocabulary, and how fiction was often more dangerous than nonfiction because people let their guard down when it's entertaining. It wasn't even that she was wrong about everything. Some of her points were interesting, but the delivery? It felt like she'd already decided I wasn't good enough, and now she was just collecting evidence. After maybe an hour of this, I said I needed to head home. She looked surprised, like she genuinely thought we were having a productive bonding moment. She asked if I wanted to hang out again, and I just kind of shrugged and said, "I'll text you." I didn't. She messaged me the next day with a link to a blog post about decolonizing your bookshelf. Said I should check it out. I didn't respond. Started off sharp and cool, ended up demanding I delete certain authors from my shelf before we could see each other again. Like dating her came with homework and required reading before the second meeting. So this was during that phase where everyone was doing brunch like it was a religion. You couldn't go a week without someone texting you brunch this weekend. Like it was some sacred ritual, and honestly, I was kind of over it. But I met Brian at a friend's backyard barbecue the week before, and he seemed all right. Not like, oh my god, butterflies all right, but decent enough. He was one of those clean-cut guys with a soft voice and a calm presence, the kind who compliments your sneakers and then quotes a podcast you've never heard of. Nothing flashy, but he had a weird confidence to him that made you curious. He was easy to talk to at the barbecue, didn't try too hard to be funny, and didn't make any weird jokes about how many hot dogs people ate. He asked me if I liked jazz, and I actually do, so I said yeah. And we ended up sitting on the same deck bench for like half an hour just talking about music and travel, and how everyone at the barbecue either had a startup or wanted one. He walked me to my car and said, "Let's do brunch next weekend," and I said sure before really thinking about it. We picked a spot in a semi-quiet part of town. One of those bougie farm-to-table places with decorative fruit in mason jars and overpriced avocado toast. I showed up first and got a table outside because it was nice out. I was wearing a hoodie and jeans, not trying too hard. I figured it was going to be casual. Brian showed up about 10 minutes later wearing a button-down shirt tucked into jeans with a brown leather belt. He looked like he was about to give a speech at a town hall. He smiled when he saw me, he gave me a kind of awkward side hug, and sat down across from me. Everything still felt pretty normal. We ordered. I had the sweet potato hash, he had the French toast and black coffee. Things started out the way you'd expect. Small talk, joking about the brunch crowd, comparing bad dates. I told him about the time a guy FaceTimed his mom during our appetizer. He told me about someone who refused to eat anything with sauce. We laughed a bit, and I thought, okay, maybe this'll be all right. But then he reached into his bag. I figured he was getting sunglasses or maybe a notebook or something harmless. But nope. He pulled out this thin pamphlet with the words, "Understanding Traditional Roles," written across the top in bold, old-school font. It looked like something a church would hand out in 1998. I laughed and asked what it was, thinking maybe it was ironic. It was not ironic. He said, and I quote, "I like to bring this on first dates to see where people stand." I blinked. He slid it across the table to me like it was a menu, and I swear for a second I thought I was being pranked. I picked it up and flipped through it. There were literal sections titled "A Woman's Natural Calling" and "Leadership and Headship in Relationships." It wasn't super thick, maybe like 12 pages max, but it felt heavy. The kind of heavy where you start questioning your decisions while you're still flipping page 2. I looked up at him and he was dead serious. He started explaining how he believes modern dating is broken because people don't have clear roles anymore, and that confusion leads to chaos. He said women are taught to compete with men instead of complement them, and that most guys are too scared to say what they really want. So he decided to just be upfront from the start. He wasn't yelling or ranting, he was calm, almost like he was trying to sell me a timeshare. He said he was looking for a woman who believed in honoring masculine structure, and that he hoped I'd be open to reading the pamphlet fully before making any assumptions. I asked him straight up, "So you want a girlfriend who follows a script?" He nodded. "Not a script, a structure. There's a difference." He kept using the word divine order and said relationships thrive when people submit to their purpose. I was just sitting there holding a pamphlet, watching people at the table next to us pour mimosas, wondering what alternate universe I'd just been dropped into. Then he asked what I thought about gender roles. I said I thought people should do what works for them, and that there's no single formula for a healthy relationship. He nodded like he was being respectful, but then he hit me with, well, compatibility isn't just about chemistry, it's about alignment. If we're not aligned, that's okay, but I won't compromise my values. He asked me to flip to page 6. I did because, at that point, I needed to see what fresh nonsense was on there. It was a list of qualities of a supportive wife. I'm not joking. It had things like provides calmness to the household, lets the man lead without resistance, and does not compete or challenge unnecessarily. I couldn't stop staring at that last one. Challenge unnecessarily. What does that even mean? I asked him that. He said it meant not pushing back just to push back. That if you trust someone, you let them lead and correct course only if things go off the rails. I put the pamphlet down. Then he smiled, reached for his coffee, and said, "Most women leave at this point. I respect that. But some stay and think about it." I said, "Are you hoping I'm one of the stay and think about it types?" He shrugged. "You don't seem like the type to run from a different perspective." Which is honestly such a manipulative thing to say. Like if I get up and walk away, I'm not open-minded, please. The check came. I offered to split it out of pure survival instinct. He said, "I'll cover it. It's still a gentleman's job to pay, no matter how modern things get." That line alone deserved a separate pamphlet. I left that brunch feeling like I just sat through a slow, polite sermon I never signed up for. I didn't argue with him. I didn't toss the pamphlet. I just put it back on the table, said thanks for breakfast, and walked toward the parking lot like I had somewhere important to be. He texted later that evening saying he enjoyed our conversation and would love to discuss more if I was open to it. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't going to be one of the people who stayed and thought about it. It started at an improv show. My friends dragged me out because they said I was becoming a couch ghost who never left the house unless it was for groceries or dental appointments. I didn't argue because they were right. So I threw on a hoodie and jeans, told myself I'd stay for an hour max, and ended up staying the whole night. The show was hilarious in a weird, chaotic kind of way. People yelling weird prompts from the crowd, actors trying not to laugh at their own lines, that kind of stuff. Sumaya was part of the group we got seated next to. She had this big energy that sort of radiated off her. You know, those people who laugh just slightly louder than everyone else and somehow make it seem like a performance. That was her. But not in a bad way, at least not at first. She had these bright purple braids, a jean jacket covered in random pins, and a way of making even small talk feel like a bit. We started chatting during intermission because she complimented my sneakers and then turned that into a whole story about how shoes tell you everything you need to know about a person. She was fast-talking, animated, and weird in a way that didn't feel forced. She was telling me about her dog and her ex and how she once broke up with a guy because he didn't know who Lizzo was. I laughed so hard I snorted, which almost never happens. After the show, we got drinks with our groups and ended up sitting next to each other. She asked for my number and said we should go for ice cream sometime and rate the flavors like we're judges on a reality show. I said yes. She picked this ice cream spot that had all weird flavors: basil lemon, black sesame, lavender honey, and stuff like that. It was one of those new places with neon signs that say stuff like chill vibes only and swings instead of chairs. She showed up wearing a bucket hat and these giant sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. She looked like she was always halfway between a photo shoot and a prank. We ordered. She got 3 flavors and asked for them all in separate cups for aesthetic reasons. I got chocolate and pistachio and was already feeling kind of plain in comparison, but she was funny and didn't make me feel bad about it. At least not right away. We walked to a bench nearby and started eating, and everything was fine for maybe 5 minutes. She kept trying to guess what kind of music I liked based on the way I held my spoon. I told her I had no idea what that meant, but I liked that she made everything sound like a game. I thought maybe this date was going to be one of the good ones. Then she pulled out her phone. At first, I figured she was checking a message or something, but then she turned the camera toward me, front-facing, and started recording. No warning. Just hit record and said, "Okay guys, so here I am on a little date, and this is the guy I was telling you about." I looked at her like, "Wait, what?" She kept going, zoomed in on my face mid-bite, and said, "He's not terrible looking, but we'll see how the conversation goes." Then she laughed and turned the camera back to herself. She was holding it up at that angle people use when they're vlogging from their cars. It was so fast I barely processed it. I told her I didn't really want to be filmed. She said, "Oh, come on, it's just for fun. My followers love this kind of thing. I won't tag you." I asked her if she does this on every date. She said no, only the content-worthy ones. I asked what that meant, and she said, "You'll see later, it's always harmless." She said it like I was being dramatic, like me not wanting to be casually posted online without permission was some kind of red flag. I asked again seriously to stop recording, and she finally lowered the phone, but not before saying, Okay, don't worry, I'll edit the bad parts." The bad parts. I tried to move past it. I figured maybe she was just one of those people who lives online a little too much. But then halfway through our ice cream, she pulled her phone back out, opened TikTok, and started scrolling through her drafts. She asked which filter made me look less nervous and whether I was cool with being labeled ice cream guy. I thought she was joking again. She wasn't. She showed me a clip she'd already posted earlier in the week, another date, same energy. The caption said, "He said his dream car was a Prius." Immediate ick. I asked the guy knew she posted it. She shrugged and said, "He didn't ask." She actually started editing clips of our date while we were still on it. Like while we were sitting there talking about toppings, she was splicing together footage of me eating and her making faces to the camera. I said, "You really post this stuff without asking people," she said. "If they're uncomfortable, they can say something." You did. Most people don't care. I was just sitting there with melting pistachio ice cream, watching a stranger turn our entire interaction into an unpaid reality show. And not even a flattering one. After another 5 minutes, she stood up and said she needed to catch golden hour and left me on the bench while she walked around the parking lot trying to get the right angle of the sun on her face. I waited for a bit just to see what she'd do next. She waved me over once to ask if I could take a photo of her looking fake candid. I said no. She laughed like I was just being stiff. Eventually, I told her I was heading out. She said, "Cool, I'll tag you if it goes viral." I left without saying anything else. A couple hours later, she posted a video. It was me in the background, barely in frame, while she narrated, "Today's date, ice cream guy. Points for being cute, minus points for acting like I was recording the CIA." The comments were full of laughing emojis and people saying, "Girl, you're savage." I wasn't tagged like she promised, but I knew it was me, and if someone who followed her also followed me, they'd know too. I reported the post, not sure if it ever got taken down. I didn't look. So that was Sumaya, full-time TikToker, part-time improv queen, and completely unaware that some people still like dates without a camera pointed at their face. I met Jobbed through this volunteer cleanup group my cousin made me join one weekend. It was a park restoration thing where we picked up trash, pulled weeds, and pretended we were doing something meaningful while sweating in cheap gloves and dodging peas. I didn't want to go at all, but my cousin guilted me with that whole do something good for once tone, so I showed up and tried to blend in with the crowd. Job was there wearing a fitted hoodie and boots that looked way too nice for park cleanup duty. He had these super deliberate movements, like even the way he tied his trash bag seemed overly practiced. But he was friendly, offered me water, made a dumb joke about raccoons being the original park rangers, and we ended up working the same zone. He was surprisingly chill to talk to. We shared some stories, talked about how much the gloves sucked, and bonded over how long the organizers kept talking about safety. At the end, he asked if I wanted to grab a drink sometime. I said yeah because honestly, he seemed decent. Smart, funny, not too try hard. Just seemed like someone who could hold a conversation without it getting weird. We made plans to meet at this quiet bar a few nights later. Not one of those rowdy downtown places with neon signs and sticky tables. This one was tucked in the corner of a street with no parking, the kind of bar with soft lighting and bartenders that don't speak unless spoken to. It had character. A few booths, some jazz playing low, and an old jukebox no one used anymore. He was already sitting at a corner table when I got there. He gave me a small wave, stood up when I walked in, and ordered drinks without asking what I wanted. That struck me as a little odd, but he picked something safe, an old-fashioned for himself, a gin and tonic for me. I didn't mind. It was kind of old school in a polite way. We started off talking about the usual, how we got roped into volunteering, mutual burnout from work, why cleaning public parks always seems to involve mystery slime. I felt pretty relaxed. He was a good talker. Not too loud, not too much. He made direct eye contact, had this calm voice, and everything about him felt practiced. Like he had this conversation before, maybe several times. But somewhere around the second drink, things started to shift. He asked me what I studied in school, and I told him. And he asked what I wanted to do originally before my current job. I said something about grad school, then casually mentioned I considered going back one day. He paused, took a sip, then leaned forward like we were about to get into something serious. He said, "I think education's great, but for women, that's kind of a dangerous path." I blinked, thought maybe I misunderstood. But no, he kept going. He said higher education confuses priorities for women and pulls them away from what really matters. That when women pursue degrees past a certain level, it puts them on this independent track that's incompatible with family values. He actually said that. Incompatible with family values. I thought he was kidding. I even kind of smiled, waiting for him to laugh or roll his eyes. But he didn't. He was dead serious. He leaned back in his chair like he'd just dropped a truth bomb I was supposed to be impressed by. I asked him what he meant exactly because I like giving people a chance to backpedal when they say dumb things. But he doubled down. He said women pursuing high-level careers were chasing masculine success, and that the more educated a woman was, the less likely she'd be willing to respect a man's leadership. I sat there, letting that sink in, while Billie Holiday played softly in the background and my drink suddenly didn't taste so good anymore. I asked him why he assumed men were supposed to lead. He said it wasn't about ego, it was about structure. That every functional relationship, as a leader and a supporter, and biologically, men were designed to be in charge. He even said, it's not oppression, it's order. I wish I was making that line up. I could feel myself starting to tune out. He just kept talking about how modern dating was suffering because women were too busy chasing degrees and building businesses to build homes. He said something about how college teaches women to prioritize ambition over submission, and how we'd be better off if we didn't feel so much pressure to be everything. It wasn't just the words, it was the delivery, like he was explaining something I hadn't figured out yet. I thank him later for this clarity. I asked him if he'd date someone who made more money than him. He said no, not because he was insecure, but because she wouldn't be able to respect me the right way. Then he smiled like that made him sound smart. I think I blacked out halfway through his explanation about why women are too stressed these days because we're trying to compete instead of cooperate. He wasn't yelling, wasn't rude. He was polite the entire time, and somehow that made it worse, because he thought he was being respectful. Like delivering this quietly made it wise instead of completely insulting. I tried to change the subject by asking if he watched any shows. He said he didn't have time for TV, that he preferred reading essays about culture shifts. I didn't ask what kind of essays. I already knew I didn't want to know. After the drinks were finished, he offered to walk me to my car. I said no, thanks. He looked a little surprised, but said he understood, then said something about how he hoped I'd think about our conversation and reconsider how he'd been trained to think. I just stared at him for a second and said, "Good night." That was it. I walked to my car faster than I meant to and sat there for a full minute with the door shut, just staring at the steering wheel. It wasn't the worst date I've ever been on. It was quiet, calm, no raised voices, no chaos. But something about it left me feeling gross. I had been told politely that I was defective. He messaged me 2 days later with a link to an article titled "Feminism's Failed Experiment." I didn't open it. I blocked his number. I met Olivia through work, kind of. Not directly. She didn't work at my company, but she was close with a few people in my department. And I ran into her at one of those end of quarter, let's pretend we're all best friends happy hours. I didn't even want to go, but they had free drinks and my friend promised me sliders. I remember standing near the back by the overfilled coat rack, eating fries off a paper plate, when Olivia walked over and said, "You look bored. Want to tell me something interesting?" She wasn't smiling when she said it. It wasn't flirty. It was like a dare. She had this straight posture, eyes that didn't wander, and a tone that made everything sound like it was being evaluated. But I kind of liked it. I told her about the time I accidentally emailed my manager a meme meant for my sister. She didn't laugh out loud, but she nodded and said, "That qualifies." We talked for maybe an hour, standing by the hallway where people kept passing through trying to get to the bathroom. She didn't drink, said she was doing a 60-day reset or something. She asked a lot of questions, the kind that felt like they were pulled from a job interview book. But she listened, fully, like she was taking mental notes. A couple days later, she messaged me through Instagram, one of those casual, "Hey, if you're free this week" things. She suggested a wine bar, even though she didn't drink, which I thought was kind of funny. I agreed. We picked a Thursday evening after work. I figured it would be chill. I showed up first. It was one of those cozy places that smelled like burnt wood and had a cheese board menu longer than the drink list. I picked a corner booth. She walked in 5 minutes later, blazer over a plain white tee, no makeup except for this super sharp eyeliner. She sat down, pulled her chair in neatly, and placed her phone face down on the table like she was starting a meeting. We ordered sparkling water for her, a glass of red for me, and she asked me if I'd ever used a vision board. That's how she started. I said no, and she nodded like she expected that. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder, the kind you take to a presentation or a student council meeting. She said, "I'll walk you through it," and opened it right there on the table. It was a spreadsheet. Not a printed Google Doc or a Pinterest college, an actual spreadsheet. Printed, color-coded with headings and footnotes. The title at the top read Life Plan, 2025 to 2035. She started reading it to me like we were going over quarterly goals. There were categories, relationship milestones, career shifts, financial targets, health benchmarks. She had blocks of months mapped out with what she wanted to accomplish. Get engaged by month 14. Move in by month 10 if compatibility meets Korean status. Evaluate marriage suitability by month 22. Try for first child at month 30. I'm not exaggerating. She pointed to each section while talking, flipping pages with confidence, like she'd done this before, like this was her system. She said her last relationship ended because the guy didn't take timelines seriously, and she didn't want to waste years of emotional labor again. I didn't know what to say. I was impressed and kind of terrified at the same time. She was organized, I'll give her that. But she was also looking at me like I was a candidate for a lease, not someone she was just getting to know. I asked, carefully, if the spreadsheet was flexible. She said it was realistic with some room for adjustment, but not compromise. Her exact words. She said relationships that drift with no plan usually crash, and she wasn't interested in drifting. She wanted to build a life with someone who understood structure. She even had a note at the bottom of the second page. Non-negotiables must be decided within 3 months. Monogamy, desire for family, location preference, financial alignment. Then she looked at me and said, "So let's start there." I tried to make a joke about maybe easing into it, but she wasn't really in the mood to ease into anything. She said, if we're going to spend time together, it should be intentional. She talked about dating with purpose, emotional ROI, and how ghosting is a sign of intellectual laziness. It wasn't mean. It was like I'd walked into a seminar and didn't know it was on the agenda. I asked her what she'd do if someone needed more time to figure things out. She said she'd give them exactly 3 months, then exit with grace. I was still halfway through my drink when she asked if I saw myself being married in the next 5 years. I said maybe. Depends. She said, depends is what people say when they don't want to commit to their own future. She wasn't mad. She didn't get defensive. She just stated it and moved on. She asked if I had debt. I said a bit. She nodded, scribbled something in the margins of her spreadsheet, and circled a box. I don't want to know why I didn't just say, hey, this is too much. I guess part of me was just fascinated. I've been on weird dates before. Chaotic, messy, even emotionally draining. But this one was like watching someone run a simulation of life and trying to plug me into it. She asked if I was open to weekly check-ins. She said it helps prevent drift. I asked what drift meant, and she said, emotional complacency. Then she asked if I wanted to see her budgeting spreadsheet too, since shared financial transparency builds trust early. I said no. Thank you. Eventually, the waitress came back with a check. Olivia reached for her wallet and said, let's split evenly. It sets the tone for shared responsibility. I paid my half, left a tip, and stood up a little too fast. As we walked out, she smiled and said, just think about it. Let me know if you're ready to be serious about something serious. I nodded and said, sure. She walked off toward the train, not even waiting to see if I replied, like she already moved me to pending in her mental spreadsheet. I never messaged her after that. She didn't either. But I did think about that folder later that week, about how it was both wildly efficient and deeply terrifying, a roadmap to a life I didn't even apply for. I met Matt through a running app I was testing out during that phase where I convinced myself I liked jogging. It lasted maybe 2 weeks, and my knees still hate me for it. The app matched you with people nearby who ran similar distances or had overlapping routes. I wasn't really on it to meet anyone, but Matt sent a message that wasn't creepy, and at that point, that was a win. His profile said he liked night runs, weird smoothies, and that he was emotionally self-aware, but still working on leg strength, which made me laugh for some reason. We ended up chatting for a few days, nothing heavy. He was easy to talk to, told me about this plant-based protein powder he swore didn't taste like dirt, shared a playlist, even gave me tips on stretching I definitely didn't follow. It all seemed low stakes. He asked if I wanted to do a short run together and grab smoothies after. I said sure. We met early on a Saturday morning at a local trail, not the fancy kind with views, more like an old maintenance path next to some trees that somehow always smelled like wet wood chips. Matt showed up in a long-sleeved tech shirt and joggers, hair tied back in a loose bun, and one of those running belts with the little water bottles like he was prepping for a marathon. He waved like we were longtime neighbors and immediately handed me a protein bar that he didn't like but thought I might. The run was decent. He slowed down a bit to match my pace, which was considerate, and we mostly talked about bad running shoes, podcasts, and how everyone suddenly pretends they've always loved running once they hit 30. He had a dry sense of humor, wasn't too intense, and honestly, it felt good to just hang out with someone who didn't turn everything into a flirt competition. Afterward, we hit this small smoothie spot nearby, one of those trendy places with too many powders and not enough chairs. We both ordered mango something and sat at a tiny metal table on the sidewalk. At first, it was more of the same kind of vibe. Chill, He told me about how he used to be a hardcore night owl, but was trying to become a sunrise guy. I told him I wasn't built for early mornings and that I was still bitter about alarm clocks. He said he respected that. He even complimented my running form, which felt fake but sweet. Then he leaned forward and said, "So I should probably be the front about something." I thought, okay, maybe he's poly, maybe he's got a weird job, maybe he doesn't actually like smoothies. But none of those things would have prepared me for what he actually said. "I'm married." I paused with my straw in my mouth. He added quickly, "It's an emotional open arrangement. We're not physical anymore, and she's seeing other people too. It's very mature." He said it like he was giving me a fact about his favorite band or how long he'd been vegan. Totally casual. I didn't say anything for a second because I needed to make sure I heard him right. He kept going. Said he and his wife had realized they weren't romantic partners anymore, but still had love and shared a life. And rather than splitting everything and starting over, they decided to try something different. I asked him, as calmly as I could, why he was on a dating app that didn't mention that. He said he didn't want to scare people off before they got to know him. He believed context matters, and if someone liked him enough to hear the story, they'd get it. Then came the real kicker. He asked if I'd be open to being his weekday partner. I stared at him. He explained that weekends were when he usually did family stuff or had time with his wife. But during the week, Monday through Thursday, mostly evenings, he was available emotionally and physically for someone else. He said it was all about balance, that everyone needed compartments in life, and this was just one of his. I asked him if he seriously thought anyone would be okay with that. He said I'd be surprised how many women appreciated the arrangement, that it respected boundaries and reduced pressure. Then he took a sip of his smoothie like he'd just offered me a gym membership instead of a part-time romantic contract. I asked him if his wife knew he called it weekday partner. He said, "I don't think she'd love that label, but she's fine with the idea in general." I sat there wondering how I went from a casual run to being offered the Wednesday night slot in someone's life. I told him I wasn't comfortable with that kind of setup. He said he respected my honesty, then asked if I'd want to hang out again anyway, just as friends to keep the energy going. I said I'd think about it, which was a lie. I walked back to my car trying to figure out if this was real or if I was being filmed. It felt like someone had handed me a copy of a schedule and asked me to pencil myself in like I was a dentist appointment between yoga and laundry night. He texted later that evening, sent a picture of his dinner with the caption, "Still time to join this lifestyle if you change your mind." I blocked his number. I went to bed that night wondering how many other people were out there offering weekday love like it was some casual arrangement, and not just the most emotionally confusing thing ever. I didn't feel angry, just thrown off, like I was invited to a party only to find out it was in someone else's basement with a curfew and a rotating guest list. Anyway, I stopped running after that. Didn't even uninstall the app, just left it sitting there, untouched. Every now and then I'd see it and think about that morning, that smoothie, that whole pitch. This all started at a community cleanup event that was mostly just people standing around pretending to know how to plant things. I wasn't even planning to talk to anyone. I showed up for the free snacks and to feel slightly better about myself. You know when you're in that weird mood where everything feels off, and you think, maybe if I do one good thing today, the week won't feel like trash. Yeah, that was me, digging a tiny hole next to a stranger who clearly had no idea how to hold a shovel. Claire was in the same awkward group as me. She had black nail polish, a hoodie with a band logo I didn't recognize, and these giant sunglasses that she never took off, even when the clouds rolled in. She kept muttering about how city soil smells like wet cardboard, and I laughed a little too loud at that because it was true. We ended up stuck next to each other for most of the planting round, and it didn't feel forced. She was funny in this super dry way, like she'd spent years perfecting sarcasm to a science. She wasn't fake bubbly or trying too hard to be quirky, just quiet, observant, and weirdly magnetic. At the end of the event, we sat on the curb drinking box juice and eating mini muffins. She asked what I did, and I told her. She said she used to work in design, which didn't really explain what she did now, but I didn't push. Then she said we should grab lunch sometime. It wasn't flirtatious, just casual. I liked that. I gave her my number and didn't expect anything to come of it. But 2 days later, she texted and asked if I was free that weekend. I said yeah. She picked this hole-in-the-wall cafe that had no sign, no menus, and only 3 tables. One of those places that makes you feel like you're not cool enough to even know it exists. I showed up and she was already sitting by the window with an iced matcha and a book I'd read in college. She smiled when she saw me and said, "This place doesn't do small talk." And I had no idea what that meant, but I sat down anyway. We talked for a while. She asked me about my favorite movies, and when I said something basic, she didn't judge, just nodded like she was collecting data. I asked about her job again, and she said she did freelance stuff here and there but didn't like to talk about it. When I asked why, she said she was in between versions of herself. I thought that was deep or maybe just vague, but it didn't bother me at the time. After we finished eating, she asked if I wanted to walk around. It was one of those quiet streets with weird shops, crystals, thrift stores, a bookstore that only sold zines and smelled like dust. We went in and browsed for a while, not saying much, just pointing at random covers and making dumb observations. She picked up a poetry book and said, "This one makes you cry and you don't even know why," then didn't explain. Outside, we were sitting on this bench and she suddenly got kind of quiet. She pulled her phone out, scrolled a bit, then looked at me and said, "I just want to be upfront about something before this goes anywhere." I braced myself. She said, "Claire's not my real name." I blinked. She looked dead serious, not embarrassed, not even weird about it, just like she was letting me in on a detail I'd eventually find out anyway. I asked what her real name was and she hesitated, then said, "I don't go by it anymore, for safety reasons." Now I was fully confused. She explained, kind of, that she used to live in another city, had been involved in some messy public situation, and after everything blew up online, she changed her name, moved here, and started over. She said she wasn't running from anything illegal or dangerous, but that people don't understand how fast your life can become a hashtag. Her words, not mine. I asked what the situation was. She said she didn't want to get into the details, but that it involved an ex-blog post and a wave of attention that got out of control. She made it clear she wasn't famous, just mildly infamous for a month. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me respected that she was telling me. Another part of me felt like I was standing in the middle of a half-finished story with no way to fill in the blanks. Then she said something else. "If you ever post a picture of me or tag me anywhere, just please don't use my name. And don't tag location." I asked if there was someone looking for her. She said no, but that it was just easier to stay untagged. She told me she liked to keep things off the radar. "I've done public," she said, "and it doesn't work." She wasn't anxious while she talked, just kind of measured, like she'd said it before. Maybe not to me, maybe not on a date, but somewhere it didn't feel dramatic or secretive. More like she was laying out terms. Like if I couldn't handle it, that was fine, but she wasn't going to explain twice. I told her I didn't really post much anyway. She nodded and smiled again. We sat there in silence for a bit, watching a dog bark at a fire hydrant. I walked her to her place, which was in this tall, quiet apartment building with an elevator that looked like it hadn't been inspected in years. Outside the door, she said she had a nice time, and I said the same. She didn't go in for a hug, just kind of gave me a look like we were standing on the edge of something, but neither of us knew how wide the drop was. She said, "Text me if you feel like it," and went inside. I stood there for a second after the door closed, thought about everything. Her energy, the weird calmness she carried, the name thing, the rules. I didn't feel scared or weirded out, just unsettled in a way that didn't have a clear label. We texted once more after that. She sent me a picture of a notebook with a quote scribbled across it. No explanation, just a picture and a heart emoji. I never replied. It didn't feel wrong. It didn't feel right either. Just felt like whatever it was done. Like I walked into a movie halfway through and left before the credits rolled. It started in the DMs. Classic. I posted a story about my chipped coffee mug and how it was somehow the only thing surviving my dishwasher. And Adam replied with, "That mug looks like it's lived 1,000 lives." Not exactly poetry, but it made me laugh. I clicked on his profile. He was one of those guys who posted almost nothing but had oddly professional looking photos. One was him holding a guitar, one was him mid-laugh with blurry friends in the background, and one was just a cappuccino with a deep caption. He messaged again later that day. Something short, something clever. I liked the vibe. He wasn't pushing too hard, and I've been stuck in a cycle of liking people who ghost after 2 days, so I figured what the hell. I asked if he wanted to grab coffee, and he said yeah, like it was already part of his plan. We met at this tiny spot downtown, one of those coffee shops with exactly 4 tables and one weird couch no one wants to sit on because it sinks in the middle. He was already there when I walked in, sitting by the window, scrolling on his phone and sipping something that looked too expensive for the paper cup it was in. I sat down and he smiled like we were already halfway through a conversation. It was easy from the jump. He was smooth but not sleazy, kind of charming in a dry, unbothered way. We talked about music mostly, and housing prices. He joked that we were probably both secretly roommates with our parents and just pretending to be adults. I laughed and told him I hadn't lived at home since college. He looked genuinely impressed and said, "Okay, so you're ahead of me." I thought he was kidding, but then he said, "Actually, I've been looking for a roommate if you know anyone." And then he paused, smiled, and added, "Or if you're looking." I laughed again because I thought he was being playful. You know, one of those jokes you say on a first date to test if someone would ever maybe live with you 5 years down the road. But then he pulled out his phone and showed me a listing. His listing. For a 2-bedroom apartment in the middle of the city. Rent was decent, location was solid, and it looked like he'd already written up a full description with bullet points and move-in dates. "You're joking," I said. He shook his head and leaned forward like he was about to pitch a business idea. "You said your building sucks, right? This one's got laundry, a decent kitchen, and way less street noise. I need someone to sign with by the end of the month or I lose it." I blinked. He took a sip of his coffee and added, "And if we hit it off, dating would just be the bonus." I waited for the part where he said, "Just messing with you," but it never came. He told me he'd been applying for this lease solo, but the management company told him he needed a second person on the paperwork because of income to rent ratio or whatever. He didn't want a stranger off Craigslist and figured, if I'm meeting people anyway, why not double up? I didn't know whether to laugh, walk out, or ask how many people he pitched this to. He said I was the first, that he didn't want to freak me out, but he felt like it made sense. "It's practical," he said. "We're adults. Why waste time if there's a way to build something real and split utilities?" I asked him how we even do that. Move in and hope the vibe was good. Set boundaries. Have rotating fridge shelves. He shrugged and said, "We figure it out. I'm pretty easy to live with. I don't cook smelly food or throw parties." He made it sound so normal. Like people just co-sign leases with strangers they met online over a latte and call it dating. I told him I was just there for coffee and conversation, not a contract. He nodded like he got it, but then said, "Look, we get along, yeah. This is just a shortcut." A shortcut. Like skipping over the whole getting to know you part and fast forwarding straight to split this rent with me and maybe we'll fall in love later. He wasn't creepy about it. That's what made it weird. He didn't pressure, didn't push. Just sat there sipping coffee like he offered me a discount on a subscription plan. I told him I wasn't looking to live with anyone, that I didn't even like sharing space with my plants, let alone a dude I just met. He smiled, nodded, and said, "Fair. You're probably too smart for it anyway." The rest of the date went quiet after that. We talked a bit more, mostly about neighborhoods and grocery store hacks, but the air had shifted. He didn't seem mad or embarrassed, just kind of neutral, like the offer was still floating in the air if I changed my mind. When we got up to leave, he held the door for me and said, "No pressure, but let me know if your place gets too noisy. I've got a room with your name on it." I laughed mostly out of shock and walked to my car replaying the whole thing in my head. It wasn't even a bad date, but it felt like being handed a lease agreement instead of a second date. He texted me 2 days later with a photo of the kitchen in the apartment. Said they added a new faucet and that the dishwasher actually worked. I didn't reply. He followed up once with a thumbs up emoji, which somehow made it even stranger. Like he was waiting for me to circle back when my rent went up or something. I didn't end up moving, obviously. I did, however, start locking my building's laundry room more often, just in case my washer tried to offer me a relationship next. I found Jenna through this music forum I used to lurk on during long bus rides home. It wasn't a dating thing at all, just a place where people shared set lists, argued about production quality, and posted blurry concert photos. She commented on one of my posts about a show I'd been to last summer, and we ended up DMing for a few days. It wasn't flirty at first, more like two people bonding over shared disappointment in a band's latest album. But then she asked if I was going to the local gig happening that Friday. I wasn't planning to, but after a bit of back and forth, she offered to grab an extra ticket and said we could meet up. I figured if nothing else, it'd be fun to actually go out. I hadn't been to a live show in a while, and she seemed cool. Funny, opinionated, and she used way too many emojis for someone who listened to metal, which somehow made her more interesting. We met outside the venue, one of those half-bar, half-stage setups with a patio full of smokers and people pretending to know the openers. Jenna was already waiting when I got there, wearing a vintage band tee, ripped jeans, and combat boots. She had red streaks in her hair and two nose rings that weren't in any of her profile pictures. She waved me over like we'd met a dozen times before and handed me a drink before I even said hi. From the start, she was loud and fast, not just in the way she talked, but in how she moved, how she joked, how she reacted to things. She had this rapid-fire way of making you feel like everything was part of it. We barely finished our drinks before she pulled me into the crowd as the first band started. It was fun for the most part. We danced a bit, or whatever you call that thing where you bounce in place and yell lyrics with strangers. Jenna kept getting us closer to the front, weaving through people like she was in her own world. She knew every word, headbanged harder than most of the dudes around us, and didn't care when her drink spilled down her arm. After the show, we headed to a nearby diner to get food. I figured that'd be the time to slow things down a bit and actually talk like normal people. We grabbed a booth near the window and ordered milkshakes and fries, both of us still half shouting because our ears were ringing. I liked her energy. It was a lot, sure, but it wasn't boring. Until it was. It started when our server brought the wrong drink. Jenna had ordered a vanilla milkshake and got chocolate. A small mistake. Most people just say something and wait for a fix. But she took one sip, slammed the glass down, and muttered something under her breath about people being stupid on purpose. At first I thought she was joking. I laughed nervously and said, "No big deal, right?" But she wasn't letting it go. She waved the server back over, didn't say hello, didn't even look up, and said, "This isn't what I asked for." The server apologized and offered to fix it right away, and Jenna said, "You think I can't tell the difference between brown and white?" The tone was sharp, not funny. The kind that makes you sit straighter without realizing it. The server walked off quickly, and Jenna leaned back like she just did something heroic. I tried to brush it off by asking more about her favorite shows or what music she grew up with, but she kept circling back to how bad service was everywhere now. She said people don't take pride in the grind anymore and that we needed to bring shame back. When the server came back with the right milkshake, Jenna just nodded and didn't say thank you. I did because it felt necessary. The guy gave me a quick glance like he was silently warning me to run. She picked up where she left off like nothing happened. Started talking about how relationships are basically like battles. You find someone who can stand beside you in a fight. At first, I thought it was a metaphor, but then she literally said she once broke up with a guy because he didn't step in during an argument she had with someone at a grocery store. She said, "If you're with me, you're with me. That means backing me up no matter what." I said, "Even if you're wrong." And she tilted her head and said, "Wrong is subjective." She told me she didn't trust anyone who didn't yell once in a while. That passive people were dangerous and fake. I asked her if she ever considered just walking away instead of turning everything into a scene. She said, "Why would I walk away when I can win?" I didn't have a response to that. After a few more fries and some long pauses, she asked if I wanted to come back to her place to keep hanging out. I told her I was tired and had an early morning, which was half true. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Just said, "You're probably one of those avoidant types." Classic. We split the check and walked outside. She lit a cigarette and looked me up and down like she was assessing damage. "You're chilled," she said. "Too chill, maybe." I said thanks, and we stood there for a second, awkward, quiet, totally different from how the night started. Then she said, "Well, if you ever need backup in a bar fight, you know where to find me." I nodded and said, "Take care," and walked to my car. I didn't turn around to see if she was still there, but I could hear her boots on the sidewalk as I left. I didn't block her or unfollow. I didn't need to. She never texted again, and I didn't either. Not because I was mad or even freaked out, just because I knew I'd be the guy holding her back from flipping tables, and that's not the role I'm trying to play in anyone's life. It had been a weird week, one of those stretches of days where everything feels slightly out of rhythm. Like the light in your room's too yellow, your coffee never tastes right, and your headphones are always tangled. I was trying to snap myself out of it, so I signed up for a cooking class. I'd been meaning to do it for months, but never got around to it. It was some basic thing. Easy meals for Owen, which sounded depressing, but actually turned out kind of fun. The instructor was chaotic in a charming way, and the room smelled like garlic and burned onions by the end of it. Felt like a win. Eric was in the same class, standing across from me at the station with the dented mixing bowls. He looked like he should have been teaching the class, honestly. Tall, clean-shaven, sleeves rolled up like he was auditioning for a cooking competition. He made one joke about his cutting skills being a threat to carrots everywhere, and I laughed, mostly because I was surprised he was funny. Some people give off that too polished vibe where you expect them to be boring. He wasn't. We paired up during the last half of the class to make this lime pasta thing. Our noodles came out kind of overcooked, and he blamed the pot like it had a personal vendetta. I liked his humor. It wasn't showy, just smart and low-key weird. At the end, he asked if I wanted to grab a drink sometime. I was halfway through tying my apron when I said yes. We met the following Friday at a bar I picked, which I immediately regretted. It was louder than I remembered, and one of the overhead lights kept flickering like it was trying to Morse code distress. But Eric didn't seem to mind. He got there 5 minutes early and texted me corner booth like we were spies meeting for intel. When I showed up, he was already halfway through a whiskey and reading the label on the hot sauce bottle like it was a novel. He stood when I got there, which caught me off guard, and said I looked great, which I hadn't heard from anyone in way too long. The first half of the date was smooth. We talked about weird food combos, old sitcoms, and how awful online dating was. He was good at keeping the convo going without making it feel like an interrogation. I asked what made him sign up for the cooking class, and he said, "My therapist suggested I try something that doesn't have a goal." I raised my eyebrows and he shrugged. "I'm working on being okay with things that aren't productive." I told him that sounded pretty healthy, actually. He nodded and said, "Trying." Then, after we got a second round of drinks, the tone changed. He looked down at his glass for a long second and said, "Just so you know, I'm still a little messed up. Like emotionally. My therapist said I should say that up front." I said, "Mess up how?" trying to sound open, but not too eager to unpack it all in the middle of a bar. He stared at the table for a second, then said, "I'm still obsessed with my ex." He didn't say it like a joke. Didn't laugh or flinch. Just dropped it right there between the bowl of pretzels and the melting ice in his drink. I waited. He didn't seem embarrassed. More like relieved. Like he'd been holding that line in for weeks and finally got to say it. He went on to explain they'd broken up 7 months ago. That it had been a slow, painful unraveling. No big fights, just distance and silence. And then one final conversation that ended with, "I think we're done." He said she'd moved out, changed her number, and blocked him on everything except email. I asked why email, and he said, maybe in case of emergencies. Or maybe she forgot. I didn't know how to respond. I took a sip of my drink and said, "That sounds really hard," which felt kind of dumb. But I didn't know what else to say. He nodded. He said he still checks her artist page online, even though she hasn't updated it in months. Still has the hoodie she left. Still hears songs and thinks of her. Still dreams about her sometimes and wakes up thinking they're still together. I asked if he was trying to move on, and he said, "Yeah, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing all this." This meaning me, I guess, or dating, or pretending to be okay when he clearly wasn't. Then he said something that stuck. "I'm not trying to replace her, but I need to feel like I'm not going to stay in that space forever. Does that make sense?" I nodded, even though I didn't really know what it meant. I think he just needed someone to hear it out loud. We sat there in silence for a bit. Not awkward silence, just silence. The bar noise filled it. Someone dropped a glass across the room. A couple laughed too loudly near the door. The flickering light kept flickering. Eventually, he looked up and said, "You don't have to stay if this feels like a lot." I didn't leave, but I also didn't say, "It's fine," because it wasn't. We finished our drinks slowly, like we were both stretching time. He didn't try to steer the convo back into lightness. Didn't pivot to a funny story or ask me about my weekend plans. He just let it hang there. All of it. I kind of respected that in a strange way. When we left the bar, he walked me in my car but didn't reach for a hug. Just said, "Thanks for being chill," and stepped back. I got in my car and drove home with the windows cracked, even though it was cold. I didn't feel disappointed. I didn't feel mad. I just felt tired. Not because the date was bad, but because it was real, and sometimes real is heavier than anything you're ready for. He texted me a few days later. Just said, "Hey, hope your week's going okay." No flirting, no follow-up. I replied, "It is. Hope you're doing all right." We never made plans again, and I think we both knew we wouldn't. This one started on a darn sidewalk. Literally, dude. I was walking home from the library with headphones in, half listening to a podcast I'd already read 3 articles about when I saw a group holding up signs near the corner. I almost crossed the street to avoid them because I thought it was one of those aggressive clipboard situations where someone tries to guilt you into a monthly donation you can't afford. But they weren't waving anything or chasing people down. They were talking, calmly. Some guy in a yellow hoodie was handing out flyers, and a girl was standing in front of a folding table with a tote bag full of buttons. That girl was Lily. She was short, wearing a plain white tee with tiny text that said, "No justice, no silence." And she had this intense focus in her eyes like she was permanently mid-debate. I only stopped because someone bumped into me from behind, and she caught me staring at a stack of zines on the table. "You look like someone who reads more than they talk," she said, which would have sounded rude from anyone else, but it was so unexpected I just laughed. She handed me one of the zines without asking and said, "If you actually read this, we can talk next time." I did. The next weekend, I saw her again. Same spot, same vibe, more flyers. I told her I'd read it, and we ended up talking for half an hour about media framing, food deserts, and misinformation. It wasn't light. She didn't do small talk, but it was kind of refreshing. She wasn't trying to win me over, just wanted to know if I had a brain. We exchanged numbers, and 2 days later, she texted me, "Dinner, local diner, no frills, bring your opinions." I didn't know if it was a challenge or an invite, but I was curious enough to go. She picked a place near the train tracks, one of those diners with peeling linoleum floors and menus that haven't been updated since the early 2000s. We got a booth near the back, and she ordered black coffee and hash browns before I even opened the menu. I asked if she came here often, and she said, "Places like this don't pretend to be anything they're not. That matters." Okay then. We started off talking about the usual news, books, how messed up the education system is. I mentioned something about a documentary I'd watch, and she asked me 5 questions in a row about the director, the funding, the narrative bias, the omission of global context. I answered the first 2 okay. After that, I was guessing. She didn't judge, but she definitely clocked it. Halfway through her toast, she asked, "Where do you get most of your information?" I said a mix, some independent outlets, some mainstream, some podcasts. She said, "Which ones?" I listed a few. She raised an eyebrow at one, nodded at another, and flat out laughed at the third. Not cruelly, but enough to make me feel like I'd brought a water pistol to a forest fire. She said, "I think you mean well, but your media diet is junk food." I said, "Okay, then what should I be reading?" And she pulled out her phone and started listing things like she had a spreadsheet memorized. She told me which newsletters to sign up for, which thinkers were actually rooted in fact, which ones were secretly backed by sketchy money. It felt like being assigned homework in the middle of a date. I asked her how she even kept up with all of it. She said, "Because I have to. You can't fix anything if you don't know what you're standing on." After that, it got even more intense. She started testing me, asking what I thought about land reform, about prison abolition, of fast fashion's impact on the global south. It wasn't a conversation. It was an exam. Every time I tried to steer it back to something casual, like, I don't know, music or weird diner food, or how our server had a name tag that said Captain Toast, she'd gently yank it back to current events. She said dating should be rooted in intellectual alignment, that too many people waste time on vibes and then realize 6 months in that they disagree on basic ethics. I said, "Can't people have differences and still make it work?" She said, "Not if one of them doesn't know what they're talking about." I must have made a face because she leaned forward and said, "Look, I like that you showed up. But I need to be with someone who keeps up, who challenges me, who doesn't just absorb whatever gets served to them. You're not dumb, but you're not quite sharp yet. You're getting there." It wasn't said cruelly. It was said with the same tone my teacher uses when giving a C+ to a kid they like. The check came. I reached for it. She let me pay without protest, but added, "You know, tipping is a political act, right?" I said, "Yeah," even though I hadn't really thought about it that way until just then. When we walked outside, she lit a cigarette and offered me one. I said no. She said, "Probably a good call. These things are poison, but at least I know they are." I didn't know if that was a metaphor or just a fact. We stood there for a bit, and I could tell she was already done with the evening. Not disappointed, not mad, just processing. I asked if she wanted to hang out again. She said, "Maybe. Let's see if you do your reading." She turned and walked down the street without saying bye. 2 days later, she sent me a link to an article titled "The Death of Nuance," followed by a thumbs up emoji. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of being studied. It was at my gym, which is already embarrassing. I try to keep my social life and workout life completely separate because nothing ruins a little post-leg day humility like having to flirt with someone while your knees are still shaking. But there was this guy, Joe, who always ended up on the treadmill next to mine. I noticed him because he was the only one who didn't stare at himself in the mirror between sets. He just nodded at people who were zoned out staring at the wall like he was mentally building furniture. I wasn't trying to meet anyone. It was a regular Tuesday, and I was mid-cardio pretending I wasn't out of breath, when Joe casually leaned over and said, "You have great form." I blinked because I thought he meant like posture or movement, but he followed it up with, "I'm me on machine. It's rare to see someone who doesn't overextend." It was weirdly technical, but also kind of sweet, like the nerd version of a compliment. We talked a little that day about workout playlists, how weird the locker room smells at night, and how both of us avoid group fitness classes because of weird cult energy. He wasn't super flirty, more like that guy who asks if you've ever tried foam rolling and actually means it. Still, he was nice, polite, easy to be around. So when he asked if I wanted to grab juice after a workout the following week, I said sure. We met outside this juice place a few blocks away. One of those spots where everything on the menu is green and you're not totally sure if you're about to spend $12 on blended lawn. He ordered something with spirulina and flax and asked if I wanted to split a protein cookie. That part made me laugh. He was too serious to be smooth, but trying anyway. The conversation was fine at first. We talked about stretching routines, growing up in boring suburbs, how he once sprained his ankle trying to race his cousin during a 4th of July cookout. He had a soft voice and these hyper-specific opinions about which nut butters were overrated. It was oddly calming. He didn't interrupt. He didn't brag. Honestly, for a while, I was kind of into it. Then, somewhere between sips, he said, "Okay, I want to bring something up. Just because I'm looking for alignment, and I think communication should be upfront." I braced for something casual, maybe a job that required weird hours or that he had a pet iguana or something. But then he pulled a folded piece of paper out of his jacket pocket. Not even joking. A full piece of paper creased down the middle. I thought it was a joke. He laid it flat on the table and said, "This is the agreement I usually give to someone I'm seriously seeing. I know it's early, but transparency matters." At this point, I didn't know whether to laugh or check for hidden cameras. I looked down, and there it was. A printed document titled "Personal Relationship Terms and Guidelines." It had bullet points, paragraphs, even underlines. I scanned the page and felt my stomach flip. There were rules. Rules about texting frequency, about physical affection, no public displays beyond hand-holding unless explicitly agreed upon. Rules about social media, no tagging or posting couple content unless reviewed first. Then, I kid you not, a section titled "Family Coordination" that stated any serious partner must be open to weekly check-ins with his mom. Weekly, not holidays, not big events. Weekly. I asked, "You're serious?" He nodded and said, "Most relationship problems come from unclear expectations. I'm just eliminating confusion." I told him we'd only just met. Like, this was our first official hangout outside the gym. He said he knew, but if things clicked, he didn't want to waste time. Said he was looking for high-structure intimacy. I asked him what that even meant. He said it meant intentional dating with specific behavioral expectations, that love should be optimized, and random affection was inefficient and often misleading. He compared emotional compatibility to shared data inputs. I asked if he was writing a business plan or trying to date someone. He smiled like he practiced this part in a mirror. This is just the framework. The rest can be adapted. I kept reading the paper. There was a note about celebrating only approved holidays to avoid obligatory performance affection. He included a list of topics he refused to discuss unless emotionally neutral. Politics, past relationships, and what he called existential spirals were all off the table unless scheduled. Yes, scheduled. I asked about that part. He said, everyone spirals sometimes. I just prefer to schedule them so I can be fully present for them. I don't even know how I kept a straight face. Then came the part about mutual location preferences. Apparently, if things went well, he hoped I'd be open to relocating near his parents because emotional proximity to family is crucial for long-term alignment. I put the paper down and said, this is way too much for me. Not rude, just honest. He looked surprised but not offended. He asked, could I ask what part didn't align with you? Like it was a survey. I said, all of it, the whole thing. He nodded slowly and said, that's helpful feedback. I was already standing up. He stayed seated, folding the paper carefully and putting it back into his pocket like it was some kind of rare collectible. As I walked away, he said, if you change your mind, I can email you the editable version. I didn't turn around. I waved over my shoulder and kept walking. Didn't run. Didn't laugh out loud. Just walked until I was around the corner and back to real life. We never saw each other again at the gym, which was either pure luck or he deliberately shifted his workout schedule. I never asked.